It was a cold night in Burbank, sometime in the middle of the 1970s, and the studio that made America laugh every weeknight was running exactly the way it always ran. The Tonight Show was a machine built on rhythm. Johnny Carson understood rhythm better than anyone in television. He knew when to lean back, when to lift an eyebrow, when to move to the next segment before a moment could turn heavy. He knew that a single beat held 1 second too long could change how the whole country felt. That control was the whole show. It was why 40 million people trusted him at the end of their day. And it was a rule Carson almost never broke. But on this particular night, a man walked out from behind the curtain that most of the country barely recognized anymore. The applause came the way it always did. The band played him in. And then, for just a few seconds, the rhythm stopped. Years earlier, a very different George Carlin had walked onto that same stage. He was clean cut then, short hair, a neat suit, a narrow tie. He did voices and characters, gentle radio parodies, a weatherman named Al Sleet, the hippy-dippy weatherman with the funny forecasts. He was funny in a way that never frightened anyone, and Carson liked him immediately. In those early appearances, you can see it, Carson leaning forward, laughing at the timing, treating the young comedian like a promising son. Carlin was a regular. He was safe. He was exactly the kind of act the show was built to lift, and the show lifted him. Those appearances helped make him a household name in the first place. And then, quietly, over a few short years, that George Carlin disappeared. The suit came off, the hair grew long, the beard came in. The gentle characters were gone, replaced by a man who wanted to talk about the words people were afraid to say and the lies people told themselves. He stopped performing for the room his old act belonged to. Some of the old bookers were nervous. The clean-cut kid Carson had helped raise up had become something else entirely, and no one was sure the desk had room for what he had become. To understand why that silence mattered, you have to understand what Johnny Carson meant in that era. The Tonight Show was not just a program. It was the last thing millions of Americans saw before they turned off the light. Carson sat behind that desk in Burbank like a man who owned the country's evenings. A single appearance on his couch could turn an unknown comedian into a star by morning. A cold look from Carson could end a career just as fast. And there was one gesture every comic in America dreamed about. If Carson liked your set, he might wave you over to the couch. That wave was everything. It meant you had been accepted, that the most important man in comedy wanted to hear you talk. Comedians spent years chasing that single motion of his hand. Everyone in the business knew this. They knew the desk was a threshold, and Carson decided who crossed it. He was not cruel about it. He was careful. He protected his audience the way a good host protects a dinner table. And part of that protection was never letting the room get too uncomfortable. Never letting a guest go too far. The audience at home did not know they were being protected. They only knew they felt safe. That was Carson's gift, and it was also his rule. Night after night, for decades, he kept that promise. Fathers watched him after long shifts. Widows kept him on for the company of another voice in the house. He was the closest thing television had to a friend who came by every evening and never overstayed his welcome. And a friend like that does not embarrass you. He does not bring dangerous people to your living room. He does not let the mood turn sharp when you are trying to fall asleep. Carson understood the weight of that trust, and he carried it carefully, which is exactly why the rule existed in the first place. The booking went ahead anyway. Carlin came out that night with the long hair and the beard, in clothes that would have gotten him turned away from the studio a decade earlier. He looked less like a television comedian and more like someone who had wandered in from a very different America. He did his set. He was sharp, careful, funny in the way only he could be, threading the line between honesty and the limits of live television, saying just enough of what he really thought without giving the network a reason to cut him off. The audience laughed, but there was a tension underneath it, the tension of a room waiting to see how the host would react. Because everyone who knew the show knew the real test was not the monologue. The real test was the couch. It was what happened after the jokes, when the comedian sat down beside Johnny Carson, and the two men had to look at each other, not as an act and a host, but as themselves. That was the moment the whole industry read like a verdict. If Carson pulled back, kept it short, moved briskly to a commercial, the message would travel through every green room in the country by morning. This one had gone too far. Even Carson would not keep him. By the mid-1970s, Carlin was a different kind of famous. He had made the records that changed everything, the ones with the routine about the 7 words you could never say on television. He had been arrested in Milwaukee for saying those words out loud at a summer festival, hauled off a stage in front of a crowd for the crime of language. To a younger generation, he was a hero, one of the few honest voices left in a country that had learned to distrust its own institutions. But that same reputation made him a genuine risk for a mainstream network show. Television ran on advertisers, and advertisers ran from controversy. There were people around The Tonight Show who wondered out loud whether the new Carlin still belonged on that couch. He looked like the counterculture. He talked like a man with no interest in being safe. And the desk, remember, was built on safety. Carlin knew all of this walking in. He had spent years being told he was too much, too raw, not the kind of act that belonged on the biggest stage in the country. He had walked away from a comfortable career once already, given up the easy money and the clean image because he could not stand pretending anymore. Part of him must have wondered if the man who had once championed him would now keep a careful distance, a polite handshake, a quick segment, a host protecting his room from a guest who had changed too much. For a few seconds, the machine stopped running. There was no rush to the next bit, no eyebrow to cut the tension, no practiced pivot to a commercial. There was just Carson, choosing to stay in the discomfort, choosing to let America see that this changed, bearded, controversial man was someone he still respected. You could feel the studio settle, the audience unsure whether to laugh, the band waiting for a cue that did not come. It was a small thing, a pause, a lean, a question held a beat too long. To anyone flipping past, it might have looked like nothing at all. But to the people who understood the show, it was enormous. Carson was telling 40 million people, without ever saying it directly, that George Carlin still belonged. That the transformation had not cost him the one seat in America that mattered most. The clean-cut kid was gone. The man who replaced him was harder, stranger, more dangerous to the networks, harder to sell, and impossible to soften. And Johnny Carson looked at him across that desk and refused to pretend otherwise, and refused to turn away. Think about what it cost him to do that, even for a few seconds. Carson had spent his whole life protecting the machine. Every instinct he had, every year of training told him to smooth the moment over and move on. The advertisers were watching. The network was watching. The careful world he had built depended on him never letting the room tip. And in that instant, he set all of it aside. Not for a star, not for someone the country already loved without question, but for a man half of America had been taught to be afraid of. That is what made it more than a courtesy. It was a choice, made in real time in front of everyone with no way to take it back. Carlin finished his set, and then came the wave. Carson's hand lifted the way it had lifted for him 100 times before, back when he was the safe one, and Carlin crossed to the desk. He sat down in the chair that had launched 100 careers. The beard, the long hair, the whole transformed man of him settling into the same seat the clean-cut boy had once filled. And this is where the rhythm was supposed to take over. This is where Carson, the master of control, would smile, say something warm and forgettable, land a quick joke about the hair, and steer the show back to safe ground. That was the rule. Keep it light, keep it moving, protect the room. Instead, Johnny Carson leaned in. He looked at the man beside him, the one so many people had warned him about, and he did not treat him like a risk. He treated him like the same friend he had always been. He asked him a real question, the kind the show almost never made room for. Something about who Carlin had become and why. And then he did the thing he almost never did. He let the silence sit. He let the moment get heavy. He broke his own rule. Carlin never forgot it. In the years that followed, when he talked about the people who had mattered in his career, Carson's name carried a weight that surprised people. Carlin was not a sentimental man in public. He built a whole philosophy out of distrusting institutions and the powerful people who ran them. He spent decades tearing down exactly the kind of establishment that Carson represented. But The Tonight Show and the man behind the desk were different. Carson had believed in the clean-cut kid, and then, when it would have been easier to quietly let him go, Carson believed in the transformed man, too. The trust went both ways. In time, Carson would even hand Carlin the keys to the show itself, letting him sit in the host's chair as a guest host, the highest honor the program could give. You do not give a man your own desk unless you trust him completely. And think about what that meant, coming from Carson, a man famous for revealing almost nothing of himself, who kept even his closest friends at arm's length. For someone that guarded, trust was not a word. It was an action, small and quiet, offered only to the very few. He had offered it to Carlin on that couch, and he offered it again every time he handed him the show. Carlin went on to become one of the most fearless comedians the country ever produced. He kept pushing, kept saying the things others would not, kept getting more radical as he got older, right up to the end. And somewhere, underneath all of it, was the memory of a night in Burbank when the most powerful host in television broke his own rule to keep a friend in his chair. Johnny Carson hosted The Tonight Show for 30 years and then walked away quietly on his own terms, the way he did everything. George Carlin kept working almost until the day he died in 2008, still angry, still funny, still refusing to soften. Two men who could not have been more different in the end. One who built his life on control, one who built his on breaking it. One who never showed the audience anything he did not want them to see. One who made a career out of showing them everything. And yet for a few seconds, one cold night in the middle of the 1970s, on a stage the whole country was watching, they understood each other completely. The host who never let the room get heavy, let it get heavy on purpose. The comedian who trusted almost no one, trusted the man across the desk. It was not a famous moment. There is no clip everyone remembers, no punchline history wrote down, no headline the next morning. It was just a lean, a pause, a rule quietly broken. But it was the night George Carlin learned that he could change everything about himself and still be welcome in the one seat that mattered. And it was the night Johnny Carson reminded everyone watching that loyalty, in the end, was the only rhythm he never broke.